Okay, Rabbi, so we're on DAF Ayin Aleph, Amud Aleph. It's a bit of a complicated DAF, so let's jump right into it. Yesterday we saw the opinion of Ula quoting Rabbi Elazar. Ula said that when you shecht a korban that is not designated for either Korban Pesach or Korban Chagiga. It's an outside korban that you had set aside, let's say a Korban Shlomim. You shechted it on Erev Pesach, and now you would like to use the remainder of the meat from that korban to fulfill the mitzvah of Shalmei Simcha and also Shalmei Chagiga. When we learned yesterday that there are two mitzvahs on Yontif in addition to the Korban Pesach. There's the mitzvah of Shalmei Chagiga, which is that on the first day of Yontif you're supposed to bring a Korban Chagiga, and then also for the entire duration of Yom Tov, when a person wants to eat meat, he should use the meat sacrificially first, and then use the meat to v'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, to rejoice before Hashem through the eating of meat. Now, if a person wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha with that meat from the korban that he shechted on Erev Pesach, so Ula says two things. Number one, you certainly cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Korban Chagiga, even if, theoretically, you weren't to shech that animal, but you were to save it alive until the 15th. Even then you couldn't use it as a Chagiga. Why? Because a Korban Chagiga has to come min hachulin. It has to come from an animal that had not been previously designated for any kodshim use. Since this animal had already been designated as a shlomim, it cannot be used as a chagiga. So that's number one. But it even cannot be used to fulfill the mitzvah of simcha on Yontif. Why? Because according to Ula, he looks at a pasuk which talks about v'zavachta shlomim v'yachalta sham v'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. You shall slaughter shlomim and eat it there and rejoice before Hashem. He connects the verb v'zavachta to v'samachta, and that teaches me that the day which you are going to have simcha is also the day which you have to have shechita. So if you shecht the Korban Pesach on Erev Pesach and not on Pesach itself, you cannot use that meat to fulfill the mitzvah of simcha. So Ula says you can't fulfill the mitzvah of Shalmei Simcha, and you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Shalmei Chagiga with this animal. So the Gemara now says, Lema Misayele. Let us suggest that the following brisa supports Ula, and as you see, it has to do with the mitzvah of Simcha. The Torah says, "V'hayisa ach sameach." V'hayisa ach sameach. Okay, you know the song. Okay, v'hayisa ach sameach. Right. So it's a completely superfluous phrase in the Torah, because it already says v'samachta b'chagecha. It already says v'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. So what is the words v'hayisa ach sameach coming to add? So we learn from here that there's coming an additional mitzvah of simcha that is not already mentioned in the pasuk. L'rabos leila yom tov ha'acharon l'simcha. This comes to teach me that just in case I would think that there's not a mitzvah of simcha on the 8th day of Sukkot, it's coming to tell me that no, the night of the 8th day, for sure there is a mitzvah of simcha. And we're only coming and taking a segment of this halacha, but at least for now, remember we had learned the Torah says you shall rejoice 7 days, and the Gemara had asked yesterday either is 8 days, so we need additional psukim to tell me that on the 8th day also there's a mitzvah of simcha. So we have the words v'hayisa ach sameach, to add in at least the night of Shmini Atzeres that there's a mitzvah of Simcha, which means, ostensibly, that there's a mitzvah of eating sacrificial meat on the night of Shmini Atzeres. That's what the words V'hayisa ach sameach are coming to teach me. Ata omer leile yom tov ha'acharon o eina ela leile yom tov harishon. So then the Brisa questions that. Maybe no. Maybe it's not coming to include the night of Shmini Atzeres. Maybe it's coming to include the first night of Sukkot, to tell me that there's a mitzvah of eating Shalmei Simcha on the first night of Sukkot. Talmud Omar, ach, chalak. So therefore the Torah gives me, even within this riboy, even within this inclusive clause, it gives me an exclusive word, which is the word ach. Ach usually is coming to exclude something. So therefore, the pasuk is coming to include something, it's coming to exclude something, and therefore we learn that it's coming to include the night of Shmini Atzeres, and it's coming to exclude the first night of Sukkot from the mitzvah of Shalmei Simcha. So my time, so the Gemara says, why do we automatically assume that the word ach is coming to exclude Simcha on the first night of Sukkot? Lav mishum de'ein lo bameh yismach. It must be like Ula had said, that since the first night of Sukkot, you can't bring a korban at nighttime, right? So the only way that you could have meat from a korban the first night of Sukkot is if you had shechted the animal and offered it as a korban on Erev Sukkot. And yet, you see from the Torah that you can't fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha the first night of Sukkot. So this proves Ula's point, is that if you shechted the shlomim on Erev Sukkot, you cannot use that meat to fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha on Yantif itself. QED. That's the Gemara's argument. So the Gemara says, lo. No, that's not a raya. Kidetani taima. Because if you look at the Brisa tells you the reason why it includes the night of Shmini Atzeres and excludes the first night of Sukkot. Not because it's impossible to have Simcha the first night of Sukkot, but rather because of the following argument. Ma rois l'rabos leila yom tov ha'acharon u'lahotzi leila yom tov rishon mar ba'ani leila yom tov ha'acharon sheyesh simcha lefanov v'motzi ani leila yom tov ha'rishon she'ein simcha lefanov. That there's logic involved. Basically, the Brisa looks at it and says, look, I've got an exclusive clause and I've got an inclusive clause. And so the two clauses, one is referring to the night of Shmini Atzeres and one is referring to the first night of Sukkot. Which one is which? Is the exclusive on the first night and the inclusive on the last night, or vice versa? Logic dictates that the inclusive clause should be referring to the night of Shmini Atzeres. Why? Because it makes more sense to say that you should have Simcha on the night of Shmini Atzeres, because it is a night that is following several days of Simcha. Whereas the first night of Sukkot is not cumulatively a time when we would intuitively say that there should be Simcha, because it's not preceded by days of Simcha. And therefore, if I have an exclusive clause and an inclusive clause regarding the mitzvah of Simcha, it makes more sense that the Torah is including the night of Shemini Atzeres and excluding the first night of Sukkot. Not because it's impossible to have meat then, it's very possible, like Ula suggests, but rather because of the logic of the exclusive versus inclusive. Massive Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef now challenges Ula from the following brisa. Chagigas arba'as ar yotze ba mishum simcha ve'in yotze ba mishum chagiga. Now we had seen this brisa before. This brisa was taught to us yesterday. And we had explained it differently from the way that Rav Yosef understands it. But at least the way Rav Yosef understands this one clause from the brisa is as follows. Remember, you know that there's in addition to the korban chagiga that you bring on the 15th, there's also a korban chagiga that you have to bring in tandem with the korban pesach on the 14th. That's what we learned yesterday, right? So that korban chagiga, you can be yotzei the mitzvah of simcha with. You just can't be yotzei the mitzvah of chagiga on the 15th with that which you had set aside for the 14th. So now, amai. So the Gemara's question is why? If you look at this brisa at face value, it seems to be telling me that even though I slaughtered the chagiga of the 14th on the 14th, I could still eat the meat on the 15th and fulfill the mitzvah of simcha. That goes directly contra to what Ula had said, that if you slaughter it before Yantif, you can't fulfill the mitzvah of simcha on Yantif. The Gemara says, to answer that, Amar Avidi bar Abin, she'ike v'shachtam, that, no, you misread the brisa. The brisa is not telling you that you shechted it on the 14th. You had a korban chagiga that you had planned to shecht in tandem with the korban pesach. For whatever reason, you ended up not doing it. Right? There could be a number of reasons, but the most obvious reason is because the only reason to shecht the chagiga with the pesach is if you don't have enough meat because your chabura is too large. Let's say a whole bunch of guys drop out of the chabura, and you have plenty of meat in the korban pesach itself. So then you don't need the korban chagiga anymore to be shechted together with the korban pesach. So you have it left over, and now you want to use it for your korban chagiga for the 15th or for shalmei simcha. So the brisa says korban chagiga, sorry, you can't. It's already been pre-designated as kodshim, and the korban chagiga on the 15th has to be min hachulin, has to be from chulin. But what you can use it for is it's a live animal, shecht it now for shalmei simcha, and it's no problem. On the 15th. And Amar Ravashi Hachanami Mistavra. Ravashi says it's actually quite demonstrable that that's the correct interpretation. Di'ilote mahachi, because if you were to learn it the previous way you thought, Hamasnisa man ketani la ben tema. We already established yesterday that the author of that larger brisa, of which this is one clause, is according to Ben Tema. Now remember, what did we learn about Tema yesterday? Ben Tema is of the opinion, Ben Tema hapasla belina shmamina. Ben Tema holds that the Korban Chagiga that you shecht on the 14th in tandem with the Korban Pesach has the same expiration time as the Korban Pesach itself. So how could the Brisa possibly say that you could eat it on the day of the 15th when the Korban Pesach cannot be eaten on the day of the 15th? So therefore, this Brisa cannot be talking about a case where you shechted it on the 14th, because it would be impossible to eat on the 15th according to Ben Tema. So Shema Mino, we see from here that we're not talking about when you shechted it on the 14th, but rather you left it over until the 15th and you want to shecht it today. Masiv Rava. So now Rava says, let me show you another brisa which challenges Ula. Hahalel behasimcha shmoina. That we'll learn this more in Maseches Sukkah, of course, but there's a Mishnah that says that there's a mitzvah of reciting Hallel and a mitzvah of Simcha for all 8 days of Sukkot, the 7 days of Sukkot and the 8th day of Shmini Atzeres. Now, the Iyamart ba'inan zvicha b'shas Simcha, and if you're going to tell me that the shechita has to take place at the same time when you are capable of having simcha, i.e., the shechita has to take place on Yontif itself, then there are plenty of times when it's impossible to fulfill the mitzvah of simcha for all 8 days. Because what happens if Shabbos falls out in the middle of Sukkot, any day other than the first day of Sukkot, no big deal. For a shlomim, you always have 2 days to eat it. So even if I shech the korban on Erev Pesach, Erev Shabbos, even if I shech the shlomim on Erev Shabbos, it's still on Sukkot itself. So therefore, I'm fulfilling the requirement that the shechita be during a time of Yontif. But what happens if the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos? I can't shech the Shalmei Simcha on Shabbos itself. The only time that I could shech it in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha on the first day is before Sukkot even starts. That's not Zman Simcha. According to you, Ula, how is it ever possible to fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha for all 8 days in situations where Sukkot, the first day of Sukkot, is a Shabbos? Amar Rav Huna berei de Rav Yehuda misamcho b'seiri haragolim. So Rav Huna answers, he says, okay, you're right. In that situation, you won't be able to have Shalmei Simcha on the first day of Sukkot. But there's another way you could have Simcha, which is there are Korbanos Tzibur, there are community Korbanos that will be offered on the first day of Sukkot, meaning the Korban Tamid will be offered, and the Korban Shabbos will be offered for Musaf, and the Korban Yantif for Sukkot will be offered, and there's a Korban Chatas that the Kohanim get to eat. So you'll be able to fulfill the mitzvah of eating meat through that Korban Sibur. So Amar Rava Shtei Tshuvos B'davar. Rava says, I got 2 problems with what you just said. Number 1, Chada Disiri Haragolim Chai Nechalim Sli'ei Nechalim. First of all, when we give permission to the Kohanim to eat the sacrificial meat of a Korban Sibur on Shabbos, the Torah only suspends malacha for the offering of the Korban. It does not suspend malacha to allow the Kohanim to cook the meat. So the only way that the Kohanim would be able to eat the meat, if they wanted to eat the meat of that Korban on Shabbos, would they have to eat it raw? V'chai v'simcha v'chai leka. And there's no fulfillment of the mitzvah of simcha by eating raw meat. Imagine a guy sitting down to eat a raw piece of meat. He doesn't have a smile on his face, right? And that's not the mitzvah of simcha. He's not happy, right? So therefore, there's no way, even if we're talking about the Kohanim eating the meat, that's not a mitzvah of simcha by eating raw meat. And second of all, ba'od Kohanim ochelim v'Yisrael b'mes smeichim. And furthermore, you've only covered the Kohanim who will be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha, because they'll be able to partake, the ones doing the Avod in the Beis HaMikdash that day, they'll be able to partake of that Korban. But what about the millions of Jews who are not Kohanim? How are they going to fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha? They don't have any meat to eat. Bob, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, just quickly. The Korban Chagiga of the 14th, if you don't need it for the mitzvah of
Pesach,
and you want to use it for the mitzvah the next day on the 15th of
Chagiga or Simcha?
of simcha.
Yes.
So how did you? It doesn't that lower its kedusha? I mean, I was just understand. You've designated already. How do you now for simcha the next day?
Because it's still considered to be a korban chov. It's still considered to be they're both shlamim, and apparently you have a right to switch it from a korban chagiga on Erev Pesach to a korban of Shalmei Simcha on the first day. I don't think it's considered a lowering. Apparently it's not considered a lowering. They're both shlamim. They both have the same level of kedusha. Yeah, that's right. It's a mitzvah gedola lios b'simcha. Okay, so Ella Amar Rav Papa misamcho b'kesus nikia v'yayin yashin. So rather, says Rav Papa, you're right. You can't fulfill the mitzvah of simcha on the first day of Sukkot when it falls out on Shabbos with meat. But there are other ways to have simcha, right?
Have a good drink.
Have a good drink. There you go. Have a good drink. Have clean clothes. That also gives you simcha.
Herring. But
no, it doesn't say herring, and it doesn't say scotch. It says yayin yosh, and it says aged wine. Right?
Scotch.
Right. It actually was historically. Scotch had not yet been invented, but I don't know whether Chazal would have approved of scotch. I'm not sure. How could they not approve of scotch? Ki asa Rabin Amar Rabbi Lazar Shlamim sheshachtan me'erev Yom Tov yotzei bahen mishum simcha. Okay, so up until now we've been discussing the opinion of Ula, who says that if you shecht a shlamim on Erev Pesach, you can't fulfill the mitzvah of Shalmei Simcha on Pesach itself, because you have to shecht on Yontif itself. Rabin, quoting the same Rabbi Lazar, completely disagrees. He says, I agree that you can't use a korban that had been pre-designated for your korban chagiga on the 15th, but you can use an animal that had been slaughtered before Yontif. You can use the meat of that korban to fulfill the mitzvah of Shalmei Simcha on Yontif itself. Shlamim sheshachlim Rav Yontif yotzei ben mishum simcha, ve'en yotzei ben mishum chagiga. So, okay, and he says yotzei mishum simcha. The reason why you can be yotzei simcha is lo ba'inan zvicha b'shas simcha. I don't hold of that pasuk that Ula had used to connect zvicha and simcha. I hold that the shechita can be done before Yontif, before the time of Simcha, and you still fulfill the mitzvah of Simcha with that korban. V'lo mishum chagiga havidavar shebechova v'chol davar shebechova eino ba'el min achulin. But I agree that you cannot fulfill the mitzvah of chagiga with that animal, even if you leave it alive until the 15th, because since it had already been pre-designated as kachim, it cannot be used for the chagiga on the 15th, because the chagiga on the 15th can only be min hachulin. It has to be ba min hachulin. It has to be from a chulin animal. So meisvei. So now let's challenge this with a brisa. V'hayisa ach sameach. The Torah says you shall be just happy. The same pasuk we had quoted up above. What do we learn from that pasuk? We're just really re-quoting the brisa. L'rabos le'le yom tov ha'achron l'simcha. This comes to teach me that there's a mitzvah of simcha with meat on the night of Shmini Atzeres. At ha'omer l'rabos le'le yom tov ha'achron, o eina el l'rabos le'le yom tov ha'rishon. Maybe not. Maybe when the Torah is coming to add the mitzvah, an additional mitzvah of simcha, it's not adding it to the last night, but rather to the first night. So Talmud Lomar ach cholak. Therefore, you have the word ach to tell you that no, it's excluding one night and including one night, so we include the last night and we exclude the first night. My time, lav mishum de'en lo b'meh yismach. So doesn't this go against what Rabin was saying? The reason why you can't fulfill the mitzvah of simcha the first night, like we had mentioned before, like Ula had said, is because you can't shecht from the day before to fulfill the mitzvah of simcha on Yontif. The Gemara says, lo. No, Kedatanya. The Bryce itself had told you why. Ma rois l'rabos leile yom tov ha'achron ulahotzi leile yom tov ha'rishon. Mar ba'ani leile yom tov ha'achron sheyesh simcha lefanav ha'motzi ani leile yom tov ha'rishon shein simcha lefanav. The exact same thing we had said above. It's based purely on logic, not based on the logistical impossibility of having simcha on the first night. No, it's logistically possible, as Rabin said. You could shecht before Yontif. However, since I have one pasuk, which is one clause which is a riboy, one clause which is a miyut, I have to exclude one day and include one day. It's more logical to include the night of Shmini Atzeres for simcha and to exclude the first night, as I mentioned before, because the first night is not preceded by multiple days of simcha, where the night of Shmini Atzeres is. Amar of Kahana. Minayin le'emuri chagigas chamisha asar shenifsan belina. Now we have another discussion, and it is as follows. How do we know that the kishkas and the fats that are placed on the mizbeach of a korban chagiga, how do you know that they become pasul belina? Which means as follows. Which means that when I bring the korban chagiga on the 15th, how do you know that I have to make sure that the kishkas that are meant for the mizbeach are burned by the morning? And if they're left over after the morning, then they become pasul belina. How do I know this? Shenamar v'lo yalin chelev chagi ad boker v'samuch le reishis. So he says it's based upon the following phrases in the Torah. The Torah says, do not leave over the fats of my chagiga until the morning. And then right after the word morning is written, the very first word of the following pasuk is reishis bikurei ad masacha. Right? The word reishis. So the word reishis, which is written right after the word boker, tells me that the word boker here means don't leave it over until the very next morning. And therefore that teaches me I can't leave it over if I'm shechting it on the 15th, I can't leave it over till the very next morning, which is the morning of the 16th. Okay? So that's how I know that the korban chagiga has to be, the kishkas have to be totally burned by the following morning. So lememra dahai boker rishon. So that's the statement, and that teaches me that when the Torah says don't leave it over until the morning, it's the very next morning, the morning of the 16th. So maskef lo Rav Yosef, time at the cost of rashis, alo cost of rashis havamina my boker sheni. So he's asked like this. He says, "Are you telling me that it's only because the Torah has this adjacent word of rashis? So what would you have said if the Torah had not had the word rashis? Would you have said that when the Torah says do not leave it over until the morning, it means the following morning, the morning of the 17th? Mi'ikamidi debasar ifsale me'urta ve'imur nad safra. Why would you even entertain such a possibility? I mean, after all, the expiration of the edible meat is only for 2 full days, the 15th and the 16th. But by the night of the 17th, already the meat that's consumable to humans is usr. So surely the fats cannot be extended beyond the time of edibility of the meat. The assumption is we always have to be more machmir with God's portion than we are with the human portion. If the human portion of the korban expires by the night of the 17th, then surely the divine portion has to expire well before then as well. So why would I think that the word boker, if the word rashis had not been written in the Torah, would mean that you're allowed to leave it over until the morning of the 17th? That doesn't make any sense. So the Gemara says, Amalei Abaye Lamalo. Abaye says, not so fast. I can show you a precedent where you are allowed to leave over God's portion of the Mizbeach and let that linger longer than the human portion. Let me show you. V'harei Pesach l'Rebbi Elazar ben Azariah, de basar ifsale mechatzos ve'emurin ad safra. Here's the precedent. Now we know that the korban pesach, we paskin that the korban pesach midioraisa is allowed to be eaten the entire night, and it's the chachamim who said that you can only eat it until chatzos. You're familiar with that, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to learn all about that later on. However, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah disagrees. He says that even midioraisa, you're only allowed to eat the korban pesach until chatzos. Now, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah agrees that the emurin, the divine portion of the korban pesach, the kishkas that are placed on the mizbeach, are allowed to continue burning until morning. So you see a precedent where the human portion has a shorter shelf life than the divine portion. So maybe Taka says Abaya, that would be how I would have interpreted the pasuk by Chagiga as well, had the Torah not written rashis. I would have said that the word boker does not mean the immediately following morning, but it means the morning of the 17th. So Amar Rava, Rav Yosef Hachi Kakashale. Rava says, even though, Abaya, you're right in your response, but you really didn't understand the true depth of Rav Yosef's question. Rav Yosef was really asking a question from the following. Mi ikamidi di ilu tana lebasar lo boi rashis, v'Rav Kahana le'emurin boi rashis. Really what Rav Yosef was asking is that we're going to see a brisa in just a moment where it's very clear to the Tana of this brisa that when the Torah just writes the word boker, it means the morning immediately following. even without the word rashis. And therefore, why is it that Rav Kahana requires the word rashis to reflect that which the Tana of the Brisa knows without the word rashis? That's really Rav Yosef's question. So now the Gemara says, Mahi. So what Brisa is Rav Yosef, or you, Rav, are reading into Rav Yosef's question, what Brisa are you referring to? The Tanya, Lo Yalin min habasar asher tizbach ba'erev b'yom harishon laboker. So the Torah says, and this is also referring to the Korban Chagiga. However, over here, there's one change. Here, the Chagiga that we're talking about over here is the Korban Chagiga of the 14th, not the Korban Chagiga of the 15th. The previous pasuk that Rav Kahana was bringing was a reference to the Korban Chagiga on the 15th. Here we're talking about the Korban Chagiga that is brought in tandem with the Korban Pesach on the 14th. And there...
This has to be together
with the Korban Pesach. And here the Torah says, do not leave over from the meat that you shall offer in the evening, Bayom Harishon Laboker. That's a very strange language, because the Torah should have simply written, don't leave over Lo Yalimin Habasar Asher Tizbach Ba'erev Laboker, or Ad Haboker. But why does the Torah have to use those extra two words, Bayom Harishon Laboker? That's a very strange language. It's superfluous. And therefore, limeid al chagigas yudalid shene'echeles lishnei yomim v'layla echad. This teaches me that the korban chagiga that you bring on the 14th is allowed to be eaten on the 15th. When the Torah says, do not leave over of the meat until the morning, it does not mean the morning immediately following the 14th, but rather it means the morning after the following day, which means the morning of the 16th. So that's the way you read the pasuk. So that teaches me that the korban chagiga that's brought on the 14th also can be eaten for 2 days. It can be eaten on the 14th and the night of the 15th and the day of the 15th. Then the Brisa says maybe not. Maybe it's only coming to tell you that you can eat it during the 14th and the night of the 15th, and by the morning of the 15th you cannot eat it anymore. So Keshehu Omer Bayom Harishon Hare Boker Sheni Amur. That's why the extra two words Bayom Harishon are written in the pasuk to tell me that no, you get to leave it over for the entire following day. And the only thing is, you have to make sure that there's no lingering emurim beyond the following day. So that teaches me that you have two full days to eat the korban chagiga of the 14th. And then the brisa goes back. O eno ella boker rishon. Maybe the word boker really still means you have to finish eating it by the morning of the 15th. And therefore, normally I know the halacha is that a korban chagiga can be eaten for 2 full days, but the exception to the rule would be the chagiga that's brought on the 14th together with the korban pesach. So therefore I need another pasuk to reflect upon that. Keshehu omer bo im neder o nedava limed al chagigas yudala shenecheles lebeis yamim v'layla echad. That's the end of the brisa. So comes along the brisa and says, no, here's the pasuk that will prove to me that even the korban chagiga on the 14th can be eaten for a full 2 days. Because there's a pasuk that talks about a korban shlomim that is brought voluntarily. A stam, a regular vanilla korban shlomim that a person brings as a gift to the temple. There the Torah says that if you voluntarily gift the temple with a shlomim, you have 2 days in which to eat it. And there's an extraneous word in that pasuk of im. The word im teaches me that there's an additional korban that's not voluntary but obligatory, where you also have 2 days. And that pasuk reflects upon the korban chagiga on the 14th to teach me that for sure that korban also you have a full 2 days. Now we have to unpack this brisa before we actually finish asking the question. The whole reason we're bringing this brisa is because we're explaining what Rav Yosef's problem with why you need the word rashis is. Okay, why is Rav Yosef bothered with the fact that Rav Kahana says you need the word rashis to tell me that the word boker means the morning immediately following? We haven't fully explained that question yet, but before we explain that question, let's at least understand the brisa first. Amar Mar. So let's go and explain the brisa. O Eina Ela Boker Rishon. The Brisa says maybe really the word Boker means the morning immediately following, and you only have the day and the night to eat the Korban Chagiga. But wait a minute, how can the Brisa go back and question it if we've already established that those two extra words Bayom Harishon in the pasuk teach me that you have the whole day of the 15th as well to eat the Korban Chagiga. You have the full 2 days based on those two extra words. So why does the Brisa go back on that and say, oh, maybe not? So Hachi Ka'amar. The way that the Brisa thought you might be able to interpret the psukim is as follows. O Eina Ella Bishtei Chagigos HaKosuv Medaber. Echas Chagigas Yudalid, Ve'echas Chagigas Tesvav. V'zula Bokra. Very strange way of looking at the pasuk, but the Brisa entertains it temporarily. The Brisa says maybe the way you read the pasuk of Velo Yalin what's the pasuk again? V'lo yalin min habasar asher tisbach be'erev bayom harishon laboker. You read it as follows. It's talking about two chagigas. It's not just talking about the Korban Chagiga of the 14th. It's talking about the Korban Chagiga of the 15th as well. And the way you read the pasuk is v'lo yalin min habasar. Do not leave over from the meat asher tisbach be'erev that you're going to be offering in the evening. Bayom Harishon, for the Korban Chagiga of the 15th, don't leave that over beyond until the morning. And Laboker goes on the 14th, meaning that both for the Korban Chagiga of the 15th and the Korban Chagiga of the 14th, you don't have a right to leave it over until the morning. And therefore the reason why the Torah writes Bayom Harishon is that it's coming to tell you not only am I talking about the Korban Chagiga on Erev Pesach, but I'm also talking about the Korban Chagiga on the 15th as well. And in both of those Chagigas, you cannot leave it over until morning, which means, says the Brisa, maybe when the Torah is talking about either Chagiga, it means to tell me that for both Chagigas, you can't go beyond the morning in which to eat the meat. Okay? So, Hadar Omar, Ela Dekaimul an Chagiga Necheles L'Shnayam V'Layla Echad. However, says the Gemara, but we have an established halacha that the Korban Chagiga is allowed to be eaten for 2 days. So according to what you've just said, neither the 14th Chagiga nor the 15th Chagiga can be eaten for 2 days. Im Kain, im neder o nedava b'mai. So therefore, when the Torah adds the extra word im in the pasuk talking about shlomim to tell me that there's more than just the voluntary shlomim that I have 2 days to eat it, but even an obligatory shlomim I have 2 days to eat it, what is it talking about? Ichagigas yudalet haksiv ba yom v'layla, ichagigas tesvav haksiv ba yom v'layla. It can't be referring to either the 14th chagiga or the 15th chagiga, because for both of them you only have the day and the morning until morning. Elahai lechagigas tesvav. So we therefore must conclude that you cannot interpret our pasuk to be referring to both chagigas. You have to say that the extra word im that is written by the voluntary shlomim is a reference to the Korban Chagiga on the 15th. Our pasuk is exclusively talking about the Korban Chagiga on the 14th, and it is telling us therefore that both for the Chagiga of the 15th you have 2 days, and for the Chagiga of the 14th you have 2 days. But the bottom line is, and now we're going to get into the question that Rav Yosef is really asking on Rav Kahana. Taima diksiv bayom harishon laboker. Demai boker sheni. Hakol hecha diksiv boker stama boker rishon v'afagav delokasuv be'reishis. Here's the bottom line question of Rav Kahana. The whole line of reasoning from this brisa is that the word boker in the pasuk means the following day. Why? Because it says the extra words bayom harishon. If the Torah had not said to use the words Bayom Harishon, and it had just used the word Boker, then that word Boker just by itself implies the morning immediately following, even though the word Reishis is not adjacent to it. So you see therefore, Rav Kahana, that just the word Boker, without any modifications or additions to it, means the morning immediately following. And therefore, your suggestion that you need the word Reishis to reveal what the word Boker means is an error. And therefore, why does the Torah write the word Reishis afterwards? Like Rashi says, for some other reason. A reason that we will not discuss at this time. But it's clearly not to modify the interpretation of the word Boker. Boker by itself always means the morning immediately following, unless you have extra words like Bayom Harishon to tell you that it means the next day. Okay. You got it, great. You don't got it,
We didn't get the answer, though.
also great.
But he doesn't answer.
He doesn't answer. It remains as a kasha on Rav Kahana. It remains as a kasha on Rav Kahana. Rav Yosef basically says, Rav Kahana, I disagree. Okay, Mishnah. Now let's go on to the Mishnah. Now we switch gears once again. Ha-Pesach sheshachto shelo lishmo b'Shabbos chayav olav chatas. You have a Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach, today is Erev Pesach, it falls out on Shabbos, and I go ahead and I shech the Korban Pesach. There's only one problem. I have in mind a shlamim instead of my Korban Pesach. So, even though I'm in the midst of doing a mitzvah, nevertheless, I should have known better. And therefore, even though I'm doing something that's unintentional, but nevertheless, because let's say I'm not aware that I'm not allowed to do this, but I'm still liable. I have to bring a Korban Chatas for having been Mechalel Shabbos. Because the Torah only gives me a dispensation to shech the Korban Pesach on Shabbos. I can't shech the Korban for any other purpose on Shabbos. So, Ushar kol hazvachim sheshachton l'shem Pesach, im einon re'uyin chayav, im re'uyin hein. So, now, what if I take an animal that was not designated as a Korban Pesach, and on Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos, I shecht it for the sake of a Korban Pesach? So the halacha in that case is that the korban is still a kosher korban. It can't be used as a korban pesach, but it's still a kosher shlamim. Okay. However, here's the deal. He says if I shecht it for the sake of pesach, it depends. Im einon re'uyin, if the animal is not the proper species or the proper gender or the proper age, then it's self-evident that this is not a valid korban pesach. I should have known better, and therefore I'm liable for a korban chatas. However, v'im re'uyin hein, but let's say the lamb is such an animal that is usable for the Korban Pesach. It's the right age, it's the right gender, it's the right species. So then Rabbi Eliezer mechayev chatas. Rabbi Eliezer says, sorry, even though you're still in the process of doing a mitzvah, you still violated Shabbos, and you have to bring a Korban chatas. And Rabbi Yeshua poter, and Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you're poter. And why? Because Rabbi Yeshua says, as we'll see in just a minute, that you're toya b'dvar mitzvah. You're in the midst of doing a mitzvah, and because you're famished, because you're in the middle of doing a mitzvah, like Rashi explains, he says, since you're trying to do a mitzvah, and your end result is you accomplished a shtickle mitzvah because you're ultimately this will be brought as a korban shlamim. Rabbi Yoshua says that in those situations you're going to be potter from a korban chatas.
But you can't shecht on Shabbos other than a Pesach.
Correct.
So if it becomes a shlamim, you shecht it on Shabbos.
That's correct. So Rabbi Yoshua is of the opinion that ta'a bidvar mitzvah, the asa mitzvah kol dehu potter mechiyav chatas sheba. That's exactly what Rashi is trying to explain. Since you were trying to do a mitzvah, and you did a shtickle mitzvah because this is going to be a shlamim anyway, so then you're going to be potter from a chatas. Yes, you were mechalel Shabbos, but you just have to bring a korban chatas.
Does this fly also in the face of pickle? When you have the wrong kavanas and you have the wrong timing, you have the wrong korban, and the wrong day?
No. So we have to distinguish between when I passel the korban through my machshava, or when I don't passel the korban, just that it's not ola l'shem chova.
You can still use this korban if it's shefted on Shabbos, but it's not for Pesach.
Yeah, the korban is still usable because my machshava is not a passel machshava. Pigul is where I think about doing something illicit with this korban, like I'm going to eat it chutz lizmano. I want to eat the meat of this korban past its time that it's permitted to eat. There's
also that you've designated as the wrong kind of korban?
No, the only time that it becomes passel when I do it shelo lishma is when I take an animal that's for the korban pesach and I shecht it shelo lishma. Then I taka passel the korban, right? That's when I passel the korban. Okay, right? That's what we previously learned. By all other korbanos, if I shecht it shelo lishma for the wrong purpose, it's still usable as a shlamim. It's still a kosher korban. Okay. So now the Gemara says, let's see Rabbi Eliezer's argument. So Amalei Rabbi Eliezer, Ma im ha-Pesach shehu mutter lishmo kishashina shmo chayav zvachem shein asurin lishman kishashina esheman eno din sheyehi chayav. His logical argument is as follows. Look, he says, I have an animal that was designated as a korban pesach. The Torah gives me permission to shech this animal on Shabbos. And yet, when I change its intended purpose, I'm going to be chayiv. I'm chayiv a korban chatas. So,
Hello? I'm trying to play.
that's okay.
It's right down.
No. Don't throw it out. We'll wait until it stops ringing. So the Gemara's Rabbi Eliezer's logical challenge is as follows. Rabbi Eliezer's challenge is: look, logic dictates that you should be chayav achatas in this case. Look, when you take an animal that was designated as a korban pesach and you shecht it for the wrong reason, even though the Torah gives you permission to shech the korban pesach on Shabbos, in that case you're still chayav a korban chatas. So surely when you have an animal that was not designated as a korban pesach, and the Torah never gives you permission to shech this animal on Shabbos, surely when you shecht it for the wrong reason, you should be chayav a korban chatas, you should be machal Shabbos and be chayav a korban chatas. So Amarle Rabbi Yehoshua lo. Rabbi Yehoshua says it's not a good analogy, because Im Amarta bepesach sheshinehu bedavar aser, tomar bizvachim sheshinon bedavar hamutar. He says it's not comparable. Your thought that you had when you took a korban pesach and you shechted it for the wrong reason, you changed the intent of the korban for something that is not permitted on Shabbos. But when you take a non-korban pesach animal and you shecht it, you're shechting it for the sake of a korban pesach, and a korban pesach is allowed to be brought on Shabbos, and that's why it's less severe, and therefore you should be potter from a korban chatas. So Amarle Rabbi Eliezer, Emurei tzibor yochichu shehein mutarin lishman v'hashochet lishman chayav. So Rabbi Eliezer says, let me prove it to you from the following. Now, Emurei tzibor, it's a very strange language, but what he really means, according to Rashi, is any korban that is brought by the tzibor on Shabbos, let's say a korban tamid or a korban musaf, that you're allowed to shech them on Shabbos if it's done lishmo. But if you take any other korban and you shecht it for the sake of a korban tamid or a korban musaf on Shabbos, you're going to be chayiv. So Amalei Rabbi Yehoshua lo. He says so by virtue of that, so therefore Rabbi Eliezer is saying that just like over there, when you take the wrong animal and you shecht it for permitted use on Shabbos, you're still liable, so too for the korban pesach. If you take an animal that's not a korban pesach and you shecht it for the sake of Pesach on Shabbos, you should be liable. So Amalei Rabbi Shua lo. Rabbi Shua says no, it's not a good comparison. Im amarta be'emurei tzibor sheyesh lehen kitzva tomer bepesach she'en lo kitzva. So the way Rashi explains this language is as follows: there is much greater chaos when you're bringing a korban pesach on erev Pesach than when you're bringing a korban tzibor on a regular Shabbos. On a regular Shabbos, how many korban musafs for Shabbos are there? There's one. It's brought by the entire community. There, it's very easily determined by any individual, hey, this animal is either the korban musaf or it's not the korban musaf. The korban musaf was already brought or wasn't already brought. It's much more easy to determine and ascertain whether I'm doing something right or wrong. So therefore, there's a greater level of culpability of the individual who accidentally takes the wrong animal and brings it as a korban musaf on Shabbos. On Pesach, there's pandemonium in the temple. There are hundreds of thousands of Paschal lambs making noise all over the place. What?
It's like the Sobeys parking lot.
Yeah, on Erev Shabbos, right? Yeah, or Erev Yontif. Is that there's pandemonium? You're going to see little lambs running all over the place on the Temple Mount, and you might, even if you already brought your korban Pesach, maybe you think that this is Yankel's korban Pesach, so you'll bring it as a korban. How are you supposed to know that this was set aside as a shlamim and not as a Pesach? And therefore, there's much less responsibility for you to be able to properly identify the animal, and that's where Rabbi Yehoshua says you're off the hook. Rabbi Meir Omer, Af hashochet l'shem emurei tzibur pater. Rabbi Meir says the whole premise of this discussion is wrong, because I hold that if a person takes the wrong animal that was never designated as a korban musaf or tamid on Shabbos and he shechts it for that, he's taka pater. So, in other words, he goes even further than Rabbi Yehoshua. Now, finally, shachto shelo la'ochla v'shelo l'minuyav la'arelin v'la'tameim chayav. Now we know the halacha is that if you shech the korban pesach exclusively for people who are not going to be able to eat the korban pesach is puzzle. So if you do that on Shabbos, which falls out on erev Pesach, not only is the korban pesach puzzle, but you've done a malacha because you had no permission to shecht it that way. Okay, but if it's la'ochla v'shelo la'ochla v'lemenuyav v'shelo lemenuyav lemulan v'la'arelim v'la'tamim v'la'tahorim pater. But if you shecht it for a mixed group, meaning that for some of the people you have in mind that they are kosher, they're able to eat it, and some people are not able to eat it, like we've learned previously, so then it's a kosher korban pesach, and therefore you haven't done any malacha. Shachto v'nimso balmum chayev. If you shecht it and then after you shechted, you discover the animal is a blemished animal, then you're going to be chayiv. Why? Because like Rashi says, we're talking about an external blemish, which you should have examined before. So you're more culpable there. You should have known. You should have looked at the animal before you shechted it. However, shachtav and imsa treifa baseiser pater. But if you shechted and after you open it up, you find that it has tuberculosis. So then, how are you supposed to know that? And therefore, you're an oines, and therefore you're completely pater from a korban chatas. Shachtav and oda shemashchu abalam esyadam o shemeis o shnitma upater mipnei sheshachat birishus. And finally, if you shecht this korban pesach and you discover afterwards that the owner who had been the designated chabura for this korban pesach skipped town and decided to use another korban pesach, or that they were tameh, or that they died, that's also an onus. How were you supposed to know that? There was no Facebook page that made, or Twitter announcement that made that announcement that you were supposed to read. And therefore, there too, you're going to be patur because you had complete permission to shecht. Have a wonderful Shabbos, everyone.